The captain humiliated Melania Trump on the plane, but what she did after boarding shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. Melania adjusted her sunglasses as she stepped into the sleek, private terminal. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of polished marble floors and leather furniture. She kept her posture straight, chin slightly lifted, but the anonymity she had hoped for already seemed fragile. Eyes followed her the moment she crossed the threshold, subtle yet perceptible. A glance here, a whisper there. It wasn't the usual awe she was accustomed to. Instead, the looks lingered just a fraction too long, filled with quiet judgment. This was exactly why she had chosen simplicity. No bodyguards, no designer bags, no extravagant jewelry. Her beige coat fell just below the knees, paired with understated heels and sunglasses that masked most of her face. She'd opted for elegance without excess, but now she wondered if she'd overcorrected. The woman at the check-in desk barely suppressed an eye roll as Melania approached. Her name on the ticket read Elena Marsh, a pseudonym carefully chosen to avoid attention. Passport? The woman's voice was clipped, mechanical. Melania slid the document forward, watching as the attendant's eyes flickered between the ID and her face. Purpose of travel? Melania tilted her head slightly. Personal. Destination? Los Angeles. The woman lingered a moment longer before finally handing back the documents. Private lounge is through the door to the left. No welcome. No warmth. Melania took her passport and moved toward the lounge, ignoring the brief hum of whispers that rose the moment her heels clicked away. It didn't matter. She'd dealt with far worse in the past. By the time she boarded the plane, the scrutiny had only deepened. The main flight attendant, a tall man with slicked-back hair and a self-satisfied grin, gave her a once-over that felt less like professionalism and more like an evaluation. "Seat 4A," he said, gesturing towards the plush leather chair by the window. She thanked him and settled in, her fingers brushing lightly against the armrest. The private jet was immaculate. Polished wood panels, recessed lighting, and oversized windows that framed the tarmac outside. It was exactly the kind of luxury she had anticipated. But as the flight attendant turned away, she caught the faint smirk on his lips. The rest of the crew was no better. 2 female attendants stood near the galley, whispering while occasionally glancing in her direction. Their expressions spoke volumes: raised eyebrows, half smirks, dismissive glances. She wasn't fooling anyone, they seemed to say. Melania sat back and exhaled slowly, reminding herself why she had chosen this approach. She wanted distance, from expectations, from scrutiny, from the world that constantly demanded she be something more than human. But distance, it seemed, came at a cost. The captain's voice broke through the speakers overhead, smooth yet tinged with something performative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Carter speaking. Welcome aboard. We'll be cruising at 41,000 feet today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Unless, of course, you prefer to keep us on our toes." A ripple of laughter spread through the cabin. Melania's eyes flicked upward. Was that directed at her? Minutes later, as the plane began to taxi, she felt the faint vibration of her phone. A text from her assistant confirmed that her team was tracking the flight. It was meant to reassure her, but somehow it only amplified the growing unease curling in her stomach. She barely had time to process the feeling before the first act of disregard surfaced. "Excuse me," Melania said softly, catching the attention of one of the attendants. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" The woman blinked, as if surprised by the request. Then her eyes drifted downward, scanning Melania's coat and shoes. "I'll see what I can do." 10 minutes passed. No water. Melania glanced up, seeing the same attendant laughing with another crew member near the galley. She didn't seem to be in any rush. "Excuse me?" Melania repeated, a little louder this time. The attendant's expression hardened as she turned back. "We're a little busy right now, ma'am. I'll get to it when I can." Before Melania could respond, another voice interrupted. "Some people just can't wait their turn," the captain said, his tone light but pointed. He had emerged from the cockpit and was standing just outside the door, arms crossed. Her eyes met his, but she refused to let her composure slip. "Busy flight?" she asked, her voice even. "Something like that," he replied, glancing around as if searching for a reason to remain outside the cockpit. His gaze lingered just a moment too long before he finally turned back inside. Melania sat back, her fingers curling slightly against the leather armrest. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered arrogance or condescension, but something about this crew, about this flight, felt different. The attitude wasn't just careless, it was calculated. By the time drinks were finally served, the slight had already settled in her chest like a weight. When the attendant handed her the glass, it was with the kind of exaggerated politeness that made the insult even sharper. "There you go," she said with a thin smile. Melania accepted it without comment, her thoughts already beginning to churn. She'd been tested before, of course, scrutinized, judged. But as the plane lifted off the ground and the horizon tilted beyond the windows, she began to suspect this wouldn't be just another test. No, this was something more deliberate. She turned toward the window, hiding the flicker of resolve in her eyes. Let them underestimate her. Let them assume she didn't belong. They'd find out soon enough how wrong they were. Melania gazed out of the window, her reflection faintly visible against the clouds below. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythm that contrasted with the growing unease in her chest. She could still feel the weight of the flight attendant's dismissive smile and the captain's thinly veiled jab lingering in the air. The atmosphere was charged, not openly hostile, but sharp enough to make her skin prickle. She took a slow breath, straightening in her seat. She had faced worse before, endured ridicule and judgment under the harshest of lights, and yet something about this situation felt raw, unguarded, and personal. It wasn't scrutiny for who she was, it was disdain for who they thought she wasn't. The flight attendant returned, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. She set down a tray of hors d'oeuvres on the table next to a man 2 rows ahead, an older gentleman in a tailored suit who barely acknowledged her presence. Melania noticed the contrast immediately. There was deference in the way the attendant moved, a subtle bowing of the head as if addressing royalty. But when the attendant passed Melania's seat, her expression shifted back to thinly veiled indifference. "Excuse me," Melania said, her voice calm but deliberate. The attendant paused, turning just enough to make it clear she didn't consider the interaction a priority. "Could I trouble you for a blanket?" Melania asked, her tone unfaltering despite the growing tension. The woman's lips pressed into a tight smile. "I'm afraid we're out of blankets, ma'am." Melania's eyes drifted to the overhead compartment where she had seen several neatly folded blankets earlier. Her gaze returned to the attendants, unblinking. "I see," she said softly. The attendant lingered for a second, perhaps expecting more resistance, but Melania didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, she turned back to the window, dismissing the woman as easily as she had been dismissed. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the 2 younger attendants near the galley whispering again. One of them giggled, covering her mouth. Melania resisted the urge to glance in their direction. Minutes passed, but the tension continued to simmer. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 41,000 feet. Feel free to move about the cabin, but don't forget, we're watching." Laughter rippled through the rows, though it sounded more forced this time. Melania's grip tightened on the armrest. She heard footsteps behind her and turned just as the captain emerged from the cockpit. His uniform was pristine, his tie perfectly knotted, but his demeanor radiated arrogance. "Enjoying the flight?" he asked, stopping by her seat. Melania forced a smile. "So far." "Good," he said, rocking back slightly on his heels. "Let us know if you need anything. We're here to help." She held his gaze, searching for any sign of sincerity, and finding none. He didn't move right away, as if daring her to challenge him. Instead, Melania leaned back slightly, letting her silence stretch until he finally turned and walked away. The cabin fell quiet again, save for the faint rustle of newspapers and glasses clinking against trays. But Melania's nerves didn't settle. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, the subtle shifts of glances when she moved. When the drink cart finally rolled past her row, she made another attempt. "May I have a glass of sparkling water, please?" The younger attendant, Clara, who had been whispering earlier, stepped forward this time. Her expression was slightly softer, but her movements were still hesitant, as if unsure whether she should continue the performance her colleagues had started. She poured the water and handed it over. "Thank you," Melania said, her voice warm despite the tension. Clara hesitated, then nodded quickly before stepping back. It was a small moment, but Melania clung to it. Not everyone aboard was hostile. Yet the undercurrent of condescension remained, and with each passing minute, it thickened. When turbulence hit for the first time, it was light but enough to rattle glasses. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, and Melania noticed how the attendants immediately focused their attention on the wealthier passengers, checking their comfort while ignoring her entirely. Another jolt. Stronger this time. Melania's instincts sharpened. Years of experience flying around the world had taught her the difference between standard turbulence and something more concerning. She glanced toward the cockpit door where the captain had disappeared earlier, and unease flickered through her chest. The plane steadied briefly, but the air remained unsettled. Melania turned to Clara as she passed. "Is everything all right?" Clara hesitated again, but this time her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door before she answered. "It's fine," she said, but there was a tightness in her voice that gave her away. Melania's gaze lingered on her before turning back to the window. Something wasn't right. And as the minutes stretched and the turbulence began again, this time harder, she realized just how wrong things were about to get. The whispers among the staff grew quieter, replaced by hurried movements. One of the attendants knocked on the cockpit door, but received no response. Melania's stomach tightened. She looked around the cabin, noting the growing tension among the other passengers. The same older gentleman who had been treated like royalty earlier was now gripping his armrest, his confidence shaken. The plane jolted again, and Melania heard a faint clatter from the galley as something fell to the floor. She stood, her movements deliberate, and walked toward Clara. "Tell me the truth," Melania said softly. "What's going on?" Clara's eyes darted toward the cockpit again. "The captain's been drinking," she finally admitted in a whisper. "We tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen." Melania felt the blood drain from her face. "And now?" Clara swallowed hard. Now I think he's panicking." Melania took a steadying breath, her mind already working through the possibilities. She looked at the trembling hands of the crew and the nervous glances of the passengers. Leadership wasn't a choice in this moment. It was a necessity. She straightened her shoulders, her voice steady as she spoke. "Get me the first officer." The attendants hesitated, but Melania's tone left no room for argument. And, as the plane shuddered again, she braced herself for what was to come. The plane jolted violently, sending a ripple of panic through the cabin. Glasses clinked together and overhead compartments rattled as passengers instinctively gripped their armrests. Melania steadied herself against the seat, her gaze fixed on Clara, who stood frozen near the galley. "Now," Melania said firmly, her voice cutting through the rising hum of fear. Clara hesitated, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but Melania's tone carried a weight that demanded action. The younger woman nodded and turned toward the cockpit. The cabin's tension grew heavier with each passing second. Melania could feel the passengers watching her, their expressions shifting from idle curiosity to raw anxiety. She took a slow breath, pushing down her own unease. This wasn't the time for doubt. Clara returned moments later, her face pale. "The first officer's trying to take control," she whispered, "but the captain's locked the door." Melania's stomach tightened. She had feared as much, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel all the more dire. She glanced toward the cockpit door. It was a wall now, impenetrable, separating them from the one man who should have been in charge, but had instead become the greatest threat on board. A sudden drop in altitude sent gasps through the cabin. Melania grabbed the seat nearest her to stay upright as the plane steadied once more. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, more strained, as if the plane itself shared the tension of those inside it. The older gentleman in the tailored suit finally spoke up. "Someone needs to do something," he barked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Melania turned to him. "And someone will." The man blinked, startled by the calm authority in her voice. He said nothing more. Melania faced Clara again. "We need access to the cockpit." "It's locked," Clara said. "Only the captain can open it from the inside." "Then we make him open it," Melania replied. Clara hesitated. "How?" Melania's mind raced. She'd been on enough flights, dealt with enough security measures to know the protocols. But she also knew something else. Fear was often the fastest way to make someone act. "Tell him there's a medical emergency," she said. "One of the passengers is unconscious. Make it sound urgent. He'll have to open the door." Clara's eyes widened, but before she could respond, another sharp jolt rocked the plane. A tray toppled from the galley and the older gentleman let out a curse. Melania stepped closer to Clara. "We don't have time to argue," she said. "Do it." Clara nodded and hurried toward the cockpit, her voice trembling as she knocked. "Captain Carter, we have a medical emergency in the cabin. A passenger's unconscious. We need help now." Silence. Clara repeated the message, louder this time, but still there was no response. Melania felt her pulse quicken. She couldn't let this situation spiral any further. "Tell the first officer," Melania instructed, "to override the door lock." Clara hesitated. "But now—" Clara rushed to the intercom, her fingers trembling as she relayed the instruction. Melania waited, counting each second as if it were an eternity. Finally, the sound of mechanical locks disengaging filled the cabin, and the door creaked open. The first officer emerged, his face taut with stress. "Where's the captain?" Melania demanded. The officer hesitated. "Still in the cockpit. He refuses to leave." "Is he fit to fly?" The officer's silence was all the answer she needed. Melania turned to Clara. "Get everyone seated and strapped in. Tell them to stay calm." Clara nodded and moved quickly through the cabin, her voice steadying as she reassured the passengers. Melania stepped closer to the first officer. "You're in charge now. Get him out of that seat." The officer hesitated, but Melania's unwavering gaze pushed him into action. He disappeared into the cockpit, and for several tense minutes the cabin remained eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional jolt of turbulence. When the officer returned, his face was grim. "He's resisting," the officer said. "We can't force him without escalating things." Melania exhaled sharply. "Then we need to land. Now." The officer nodded and turned back to the controls. As Melania returned to her seat, she felt the weight of every eye in the cabin. Whispers rose again, but this time they carried a different tone. Not derision, but curiosity, and perhaps the first hints of trust. The older gentleman in the tailored suit leaned closer. "Who are you?" he asked. Melania met his gaze but didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the window, her reflection staring back at her with a quiet intensity. Another drop in altitude sent a ripple of panic through the passengers. The engines groaned as the plane fought to steady itself. Clara rushed back to Melania's side. "The captain's refusing to relinquish control," she said. "He's threatening to turn the plane around." Melania's jaw tightened. "Not if I can help it." She stood, steadying herself as the plane trembled beneath her feet. "Keep everyone calm," she said to Clara, "and stay out of his way." Clara hesitated but nodded, stepping back. Melania moved toward the cockpit, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She could feel the eyes of every passenger on her, but she didn't waver. As she reached the door, the first officer emerged again, this time looking even more flustered. "He's threatening to land somewhere remote," the officer said. "He won't listen to reason." Melania's eyes narrowed. "Then it's time someone made him listen." The officer blinked, clearly unsure how she intended to do that. Melania didn't give him time to argue. She stepped past him, her hand resting lightly against the cockpit door. "Captain Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm, "open the door." No response. "If you don't open this door, I will make sure you never fly again." Still nothing. Melania took a slow breath, leaning closer. "And if you force this plane down, I promise you, you'll regret it." The lock clicked open. Melania pushed the door wide, stepping inside. The captain's face was flushed, his eyes glassy. "You have no authority here," he said. Melania met his gaze without flinching. "You lost your authority the moment you put everyone on this plane at risk." The tension in the cockpit was suffocating, but Melania didn't back down. "Stand down," she said. The captain's hands trembled as they hovered over the controls, but slowly, reluctantly, he pulled back. Melania turned to the first officer. "Get us on the ground," she said. And as the plane began its descent, the weight in her chest finally began to lift. But she knew this was far from over. The engines roared as the plane began its descent. Melania steadied herself against the doorframe of the cockpit, her gaze fixed on the first officer, who was gripping the controls with white-knuckled determination. The cabin behind her buzzed with nervous energy, hushed whispers, the rustle of clothing, and the faint creak of seats shifting under restless passengers. The captain, still slouched in his seat, stared blankly at the instrument panel. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. The faint smell of alcohol lingered in the confined space. "You need to get out," Melania said, her voice calm but unyielding. The captain's head turned slowly, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as if her words had only just registered. "This is my plane," he muttered. "I'm the captain." "Not anymore," she replied. "Get up." He didn't move. Melania's patience thinned. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the metal floor. "You've already endangered every person on this plane," she said, her tone cutting through the hum of the engines. "If you don't step away from those controls right now, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life regretting it." The first officer glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. The crew had been too afraid to challenge the captain, but Melania wasn't. She'd faced men like him before, men who mistook arrogance for authority. The captain let out a bitter laugh, but it was shaky. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "No," Melania replied, "but he does." She gestured to the first officer. "And you're in his way." For a moment, it seemed like the captain might resist again. But then, whether it was the weight of her words or the steady rise of fear in his bloodshot eyes, he finally unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Melania stepped aside, allowing him to stumble past her into the cabin. "Strap him in," she told Clara, who was waiting nervously near the door. Clara nodded quickly and guided the captain to an empty seat, fastening the belt tightly as he muttered under his breath. Melania turned back to the cockpit, where the first officer had already begun the landing sequence. "Where are we landing?" she asked. "There's a private airstrip about 80 miles from here," he said without looking up. "It's isolated, but it's the closest option." "Isolated?" The first officer nodded. "It's a maintenance airfield. No terminal, no passengers, just a runway and a few hangars." Melania's stomach tightened. The situation was far from ideal, but she knew there wasn't time to argue. "Get us there safely," she said. The first officer nodded, his focus locked on the controls. Melania stepped out of the cockpit and faced the cabin. All eyes were on her. "We're making an emergency landing," she announced. "Stay in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened." Murmurs rippled through the passengers, but no one spoke up. The older man in the tailored suit, who had been so quick to demand action earlier, was now clutching his armrests, his knuckles white. Melania returned to her seat, but her thoughts refused to settle. The airstrip's isolation worried her. Once they were on the ground, what then? Would they be safe? The descent was rough. Turbulence jolted the plane, and Melania heard more than one passenger let out a gasp. The runway came into view through the window, narrow, cracked, and lined with weeds pushing through the pavement. The plane hit the ground hard, bouncing once before the wheels settled. Brakes screeched as the aircraft slowed, eventually rolling to a shaky stop. Melania unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. "Everyone stay calm," she said. "Help will be here soon." Clara approached her. "What now?" Melania's eyes drifted toward the cockpit, where the first officer was shutting down the engines. "Now we get off this plane." The door opened with a hiss, and a set of portable stairs was lowered to the ground. The heat hit them first, dry and oppressive. Melania shielded her eyes from the sun as she stepped onto the tarmac, scanning the empty surroundings. No buildings, no vehicles. Just an endless stretch of desert and the faint shimmer of heat rising from the ground. Clara followed, guiding the passengers one by one. "Where are the emergency crews?" the older man demanded, stepping down behind Melania. "They'll be here soon," she replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. The first officer emerged next, his expression grim. "We need to keep everyone near the plane," he said. "It's too hot out here to wander." Melania nodded, but her focus remained on the captain, who had been led down by two attendants. He stumbled, catching himself before glaring at her. "You think you're in control now?" he spat. Melania didn't flinch. "I know I am." The first officer stepped closer. "We should secure him somewhere, just in case." Melania nodded. "Do it?" As the attendants led the captain back inside the plane, Melania's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from her assistant. "Tracking your location. Help en route. Stay safe." Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. The sun hung low on the horizon, and the shadows stretched longer across the tarmac. They were safe for now, but Melania knew this wasn't over. The captain wasn't their only problem. She could feel it in the air, the weight of what had happened, the whispers among the passengers, the questions that hadn't yet been asked. And as the first signs of dusk painted the sky, she knew the real fallout was still to come. The heat pressed down on them like an invisible weight as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked tarmac. Melania stood near the plane's wing, her arms crossed as she scanned the horizon for any sign of approaching help. The passengers huddled in small groups near the plane, their voices low and nervous, like whispers in a church before a sermon. Clara stood beside her, nervously twisting her hands. "No one's answering on the emergency frequency," she said. "The radio's giving us static. It's like we're completely cut off." Melania didn't flinch. She had already anticipated this, had expected the situation to spiral even further out of control before it got better. "Keep trying," she said. Clara nodded and hurried back toward the cockpit, leaving Melania to face the growing tension outside. The older man in the tailored suit stepped closer, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in her calm demeanor. "I think we all deserve an explanation," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "Who are you? And how do you know so much about handling this?" Melania met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm someone who knows how to act when things go wrong." He frowned. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting right now." A ripple of frustration spread through the passengers, but Melania held her ground. She knew the questions wouldn't stop, but there were more immediate concerns. The first officer emerged from the cockpit, his face pale. "I've double-checked the equipment," he said. "The radio's definitely out, and the backup transponder isn't working either." Melania's jaw tightened. She looked at the vast emptiness surrounding them, the dry, cracked earth stretching toward the horizon with no signs of life. "How long until someone realizes we haven't reached our destination?" she asked. The first officer hesitated. "We were supposed to check in 2 hours ago. Air traffic control will assume we diverted, but without the transponder it might take them longer to figure out exactly where we are." The older man stepped in again. "So what you're telling us is that we're stranded?" "For now," Melania said. "And whose fault is that?" He gestured toward the plane. "The captain? The crew? Or maybe the woman who suddenly started barking orders like she owns the place?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Melania felt the shift in tone. Panic was settling in, feeding their doubts and turning them against her. But before she could respond, the captain's voice cut through the air. "You're all fools," he sneered, staggering down the stairs with his hands still bound in plastic ties. "Letting her play hero while we're stuck out here like cattle." Clara moved to block his path, but Melania raised a hand to stop her. "Let him talk," she said, her voice steady. The captain smirked. "Finally ready to listen, huh? Or maybe you're starting to realize you don't belong here any more than I do." Melania stepped closer. "You put every person on this plane in danger. You drank on duty. You ignored protocol. And now you think you deserve the right to speak? I think I deserve a hell of a lot more than this circus, he shot back. I've flown more miles than you've probably traveled in your entire life. Melania's gaze hardened. And you let arrogance destroy everything you built. The captain flinched, but he wasn't ready to back down. You think you're better than me? No, Melania said. I just know what it means to lead. And it's not what you did today. Silence fell over the group, the captain's bluster deflating under the weight of her words. But before anyone could speak, the faint hum of engines broke through the stillness. Heads turned toward the horizon as a black SUV appeared, kicking up a trail of dust as it sped toward them. Relief flickered across the passengers' faces, but Melania's instincts sharpened. Something about the vehicle felt wrong. It wasn't a standard rescue crew. It was too sleek, too polished. The SUV rolled to a stop and two men in dark suits stepped out. Who's in charge here? One of them asked, his voice clipped. Melania stepped forward. I am, she said. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. We were sent to escort the passengers back to safety. You need to board the vehicle immediately. Melania didn't move. And who sent you? The man hesitated just long enough for her suspicion to harden. I need to see some identification, she said. The second man stepped forward, but before he could respond, the older passenger, the one who had been pressing her for answers, cut in. This is ridiculous. We've been stuck out here for hours. Just let us leave. Not yet, Melania said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The first man took a step closer. Ma'am, you need to cooperate. Melania's shoulders squared. And you need to explain why you didn't arrive with the proper rescue team. The man's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Clara's voice rang out from the top of the stairs. Mel. She caught herself, her eyes darting nervously toward the others. Elena, there's something you need to see. Melania turned without hesitation, climbing the steps two at a time. Inside the plane, Clara held out her phone. They're talking about us, she said, her voice shaking. The screen displayed news alerts and social media posts, reports of a missing plane, speculation about mechanical failures and hijackings. And then, at the bottom of the feed, Melania's name. Someone had recognized her, a passenger must have taken a photo, and now the truth was spreading. Clara looked up. What do we do? Melania's eyes flicked toward the window where the two men stood waiting. We get out of here, she said. Clara blinked. But no arguments. Melania turned and walked back outside, her steps purposeful. Change of plans, she said, addressing the group. We're not going with them. The older man stepped forward. You can't just... I can, Melania interrupted, and I will. The two men in suits exchanged glances, but before they could act, the distant sound of helicopters rumbled through the air. Real rescue crews? Melania smiled. Looks like you're out of time. As the helicopters approached, Melania felt the weight of the past hours begin to lift. But she also knew this was only the beginning. The story wasn't over. Not yet. The roar of the helicopter blades filled the air, scattering the dust and breaking the tense silence that had gripped the group moments earlier. Melania stood at the edge of the tarmac, her gaze fixed on the approaching aircraft. The two men in suits exchanged nervous glances before retreating toward their SUV, their polished shoes kicking up gravel as they hurriedly climbed inside. Without a word, the vehicle peeled away, leaving only a trail of dust and unanswered questions. Melania didn't watch them go. Her focus remained on the helicopters descending toward the makeshift landing area. The passengers behind her stirred, murmuring their relief as the first rescue team disembarked, dressed in uniforms that radiated professionalism and control. Clara appeared beside Melania, her shoulders visibly sagging with relief. "They're real this time," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Melania nodded but said nothing. Even as the rescue teams moved swiftly into action, dispersing supplies, taking names, and assessing the passengers for injuries, her mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't over. As the paramedics checked on the older man in the tailored suit, he gestured toward Melania. "She's the one in charge," he said, his voice steadier than it had been earlier. "You should talk to her." The lead paramedic turned, his eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across his face. "Mrs. Trump?" Melania let out a slow breath and removed her sunglasses. The murmurs among the passengers rose instantly, a wave of realization rippling through the group. "You've got to be kidding me," one woman whispered. "I knew she looked familiar," another added. Clara stepped closer, as if ready to shield Melania from the inevitable questions, but Melania raised a hand, stopping her. "It's fine," she said. The paramedic cleared his throat, snapping back into professionalism. "We need to get everyone out of here safely," he said. "A second team is on the way with additional vehicles." Melania nodded. "I want the captain secured and isolated until authorities arrive," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. The paramedic hesitated. "We'll do what we can, but—" "No excuses," Melania interrupted, her tone brokering no argument. "He endangered lives. He's not walking away from this." The paramedic blinked, then nodded quickly before relaying the order to his team. As the process of evacuation began, Melania took a step back, letting the professionals do their work. She watched as Clara helped passengers into the waiting helicopters, her movements calm and reassuring despite the earlier tension. "You did well today," Melania said quietly as Clara passed her. Clara paused, clearly surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," she said, "but I think you're the one who saved us." Melania didn't respond. Instead, she turned toward the captain, who was now handcuffed and flanked by two uniformed officers. He glared at her, his expression a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You'll regret this," he hissed as he was led away. Melania didn't flinch. "No," she said softly, "you will." The helicopters began lifting off one by one, carrying the passengers to safety. Melania waited until the last of them had boarded before stepping inside herself. As the aircraft rose into the sky, she looked down at the isolated airstrip disappearing below them, the events of the past hours still fresh in her mind. But she wasn't thinking about the panic or the danger anymore. Her thoughts had shifted to what would come next. The fallout was immediate. By the time Melania landed in Los Angeles, the media had already seized the story. Headlines splashed across news sites and social media feeds. Former First Lady caught in mid-air crisis. Private flight disaster. Heroic action saved lives. Melania Trump confronts drunken pilot, takes control. The speculation was endless. Reporters swarmed the airport, their questions fired like bullets as Melania stepped off the helicopter. She didn't stop to answer them. She had other priorities. Her assistant, waiting near the exit, handed her a phone. "They're asking for a statement," the assistant said. Melania nodded and took the device. "This is Melania Trump," she began, her voice calm and measured. "Today's events serve as a reminder that leadership is about responsibility, not entitlement. What happened on that flight was unacceptable, and I will ensure that every necessary step is taken to prevent it from happening again." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. But this is not just about one incident. It's about the culture we allow to exist in places of authority. Arrogance, negligence, and prejudice have no place in leadership, whether in the skies or anywhere else. She ended the call and handed the phone back to her assistant. "Set up a meeting with the FAA," she said. "I want to discuss mandatory reforms for private airline operations." The assistant nodded quickly, already tapping out emails as Melania climbed into the waiting car. In the days that followed, the story dominated headlines. The captain's license was revoked and criminal charges were filed. Members of the crew faced disciplinary action, and the airline announced sweeping changes to its training programs. Melania, however, focused on the bigger picture. She worked closely with aviation officials, pushing for stricter regulations and expanded training on handling emergencies and treating passengers with respect. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Critics accused her of exploiting the incident for publicity, but supporters hailed her as a symbol of strength and resilience. Clara, too, found herself at the center of attention. Her decision to step up during the crisis earned her praise, and Melania personally recommended her for a promotion. The older man in the tailored suit even sent a letter of apology, admitting that he had underestimated her and thanking her for keeping them safe. Weeks later, Melania boarded another private flight, this time with a different crew and a different airline. As she settled into her seat, she noticed the flight attendant smiling nervously as she approached. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" Melania smiled faintly. "Just some water, please." The attendant returned quickly, her professionalism unwavering. As the plane lifted off, Melania gazed out the window, her reflection faintly visible against the sky. She knew the world had changed because of what happened, and she wasn't done yet. Her fight against arrogance and prejudice had only just begun. If this story made you think about prejudice and strength of character, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends to discuss it together. Check out the other videos on the channel for more exciting stories.